We're going to be talking about consent, teens, and sexual intimacy. Let's get after it, shall we? If there's one thing that we've now learned, having presented over 600,000 teens across Canada and North America, as well as presently working with the province of British Columbia on the implementation of the Intimate Image Protection Act, we have learned that education specific to the topic of teens and sexual intimacy is something that we need to build upon, thus the reason why we've created this informational video. Now, this video is specific to Canadian teens, but having said that, the principles and concepts that we're talking about in today's presentation can also apply to adults as well. So with that caveat, let's get into it. When it comes to consent, I think it's really important to understand that it applies to any form of sexual intimacy, either in person or online. And again, this is important to understand because some teens think that consent changes, like consent in the real world is going to be different than in the on-life world or the online world, which is completely false. Consent applies to any form of sexual intimacy, either in person or online. But when it comes to consent, really it's all about healthy boundaries. So it's all about permission from both parties to consensually engage in offline or online intimate sexual activity and understanding that a partner respects your personal boundaries and what you're comfortable or uncomfortable with. But when it comes to consent, it's all about understanding what the law here in Canada says. And here in Canada, we have something that's called the Criminal Code of Canada. And the Criminal Code of Canada applies once you reach the age of 12. So once you reach the age of 12, the laws in our country apply to everybody, no matter what province or what territory you're in. But what's really important to understand about Canadian law is this. Although the law may not deter unwanted offline or online sexual behavior, it can empower those who are being targeted in a non-consensual situation. And again, this is really important to understand. Now, when we look at the Criminal Code of Canada, they actually have a definition of what consent is legally. And here's their definition. It's voluntary agreement to engage in some form of sexual activity. That's their definition. But I also think it's really important that everybody watching right now understands that there is no implied consent in Canadian law. In other words, let's say you're in an intimate relationship. Just because you're in that intimate relationship does not mean that there's consent to have sexual intimacy with your partner without consent. Like that just does not exist in our country. But there are some specific essential elements to the criminal code when it comes to consent that I want you all to be aware of. And the first is that if you're under the age of 12 in Canada, you cannot consent to any kind of sexual intimacy with anybody, period, and stop. Now, the age of consent when it comes to sexual intimacy in our country is 16 years of age, which means that if once you reach the age of 16, you can consent to have sexual intimacy with anybody who's 14 years or older other than with a person in authority. And a person in authority would include somebody like a coach, a teacher, a parent, a police officer. A person in authority that would be the definition. And a youth under 18 cannot legally consent to sexual abuse or exploitation. Now, here's our definition of what sexual exploitation is. It is when anybody forces or entices a youth under the age of 18, no matter their sexual orientation or gender identity, into engaging in sexual activity in return for something received by the child and or those perpetrating or facilitating the abuse. That's our definition of sexual exploitation. Now, the other thing I want you to be aware of are close-in age exceptions that exist in Canadian law, which means if the youth is 12 years old, they can consent to having sexual intimacy with another person who's between the ages of 12 to 13 years of age. Any older, any younger, illegal. For those who are 13, it's 12 to 14 years. If they're 14 years, it's 13 to 18 years. If they're 15, it's 14 to 19 years. And then once they hit the age of 16, it's 14 years and above, other than with a person in authority. But what's really important to understand is that in all these age groups, consent needs to be informed consent. And we're going to be talking about what informed consent is here in a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, we have what's called the Criminal Code of Canada that sets out the laws that allow us to do or don't do things here in our country. And we know that the Criminal Code had a definition, which is voluntary agreement to engage in some form of sexual activity. That was the definition under the Criminal Code. But here in Canada, we have the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court in our country. And their job is to look at cases that come to them and apply those cases to the Criminal Code, but to interpret criminal code, to make sense out of it, at which time they produce something that is called case law. And case law from the Supreme Court applies to every province and every territory right across our country. And the Supreme Court has actually drilled down a little bit on the definition of consent. So the first case I want to bring to your attention is a 2015 case called Regina versus Barbash. And here in this decision, the Supreme Court justices stated, listen, hey, consent can be withdrawn at any time. Now, this case was specific to teens and the use of nudes or intimate images. So if it's two teens under the age of 18 in a private consensual relationship and they're sharing those intimate images or nudes within the privacy of that relationship that is non-exploitative in nature, the Supreme Court of Canada said it is not illegal to do so for teens to do that. However, if anybody in that relationship takes that picture or video and shares it or sends it to anybody else outside of that relationship without the consent of the other person in that picture or video, then what that person is doing is illegal and they can now be arrested, charged, and convicted for the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So it was specific to intimate images or nudes. However, consent can also be withdrawn in any type of in-person intimacy. So if you're engaged in some form of sexual intimacy with your partner and then that partner withdraws consent, and we'll talk about that at any time during that encounter, then consent is withdrawn. And if you continue, then what you're doing is breaking the law. And again, we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Now, the second case I want to bring to your attention from the Supreme Court has to do with intoxication by either drug or alcohol. And this is an important case. And this is a 2021 Supreme Court decision called Regina versus CP. And here the Supreme Court further clarified that the requirement of an accused to take reasonable steps to ascertain consent in cases involving intoxication. So here the Supreme Court emphasized that consent must be present throughout the sexual activity and that the accused must be vigilant in ensuring that other party is capable of providing consent. Again, important to understand, because when it comes to drugs and intoxication, sometimes it can affect consent, and we'll give you a good example of that later on in the presentation when we give you some examples to apply to the law. But what does all this law mean? Because a lot of times it's such a bunch of legal gobbledygook, which makes it really hard for teens and even adults to understand. So to kind of make sense of this and to put the law into practice, one of the things that we've done is we've turned to Planned Parenthood in the United States, where they created this concept called consent fries to kind of describe what consent means. And we really like it. It's an acronym. So what I'm doing is I'm going to take the Planned Parenthood consent fries and I'm going to apply that acronym to Canadian law. So the F stands for freely given. In other words, consent can't be given via threats or coercion and can't be given in advance. So in other words, if somebody says to you, well, if you don't have sex with me, then I'm going to do this, that is called a threat. It could also be considered coercion, which is illegal under the criminal code. Or it's also important to understand that just because your partner consented to have some form of sexual intimacy later or earlier in the day, it doesn't mean that later on in the day that they can't withdraw consent immediately, because consent applies at the time of the sexual intimacy. It's not something that can be given in advance. The R stands for reversible. Remember, consent can be withdrawn at any time. The Supreme Court of Canada has been quite clear on that issue, that once consent is given, it can be withdrawn at any time. The I stands for informed. Silence is not informed consent. Really important to understand that. And consent should never be assumed or implied in a close romantic relationship. And remember, intoxication can affect consent. Again, we'll talk about that in a case that I will share with you here in a little bit. The E stands for enthusiastic. In other words, consent needs to be actively communicated. In other words, if a person's just standing or lying there saying and doing nothing, then that is not consent. Silence is not consent. And the S stands for specific to the act. In other words, if there was consent given to a specific sexual act, it applies only to that act. Just because somebody gives you consent for a specific sexual act doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want sexually, right? Which is really important to understand. So let's take this consent fries model and the law that we just spoke about, and let's apply it to some scenarios that we at the White Hatter have dealt with. Now, these are 4 scenarios. There are definitely way more than 4, but we're going to take the principles that I just shared with you and apply them under these 4 scenarios. So the first scenario is our teens are consensually engaged in intimate sexualized touching, which starts to escalate, and then one of the partners says, hey, let's slow this down, and then pushes the other partner away. So not an uncommon scenario that we've had to deal with here at the White Hatter, or what I had to deal with when I was in law enforcement. So clearly, consent was given at the start of the intimate sexualized touching, but one of the partners was starting to feel uncomfortable, and they said, hey, let's slow down and push and kind of push you away. So at that point in time, our argument would be that consent has been removed at that point in time. So it needs to stop, and failing to do so can result in you being arrested and charged criminally. The second scenario is where both teens consensually agree to have sex, but then a partner passes out because of alcohol or drugs. So a really good example is, let's say you're at a party, you're consuming drugs or alcohol, you consent, both of you have consent, implied consent, or informed consent to have some form of sexual intimacy with one another. So you move to another room in the home or apartment where you are. As your partner's on the bed, you go to the bathroom. As you come out of the bathroom, your partner's on the bed, passed out because of drugs or alcohol intoxication. At that point in time, you can no longer have, although it was agreed to have sexual intimacy prior to you going into the bathroom, now that you come out and you see that they're passed out because of drugs or alcohol, you can no longer have, consent is being removed, because consent has to be given throughout the entire act itself. And because the person is passed out because of alcohol or drugs, consent is no longer given. Therefore, if you do decide to have sexual intimacy with that partner in that state, you are now breaking the law, and you can be arrested, charged, and convicted under the criminal code. The third scenario is where a consensual, 2 teens are consensually engaged in intimate sexualized acts, but unknown to one of the partners, the other partner is secretly recording the act. Right? So again, you consensually, both of you had informed consent to have a sexual intimacy with one another. And as that is happening, unknown to you, your partner has hidden a camera and is now recording the sexual act. Well, although you consented to the sexual intimacy act that you're now performing, you did not consent to them recording what's going on. And because of that, they are now breaking the law, and they can be arrested for things such as under the criminal code called the non-consensual recording and distribution of intimate images. Again, something that you need to be aware of. And the fourth scenario is where there is consensual intimate images are shared in a relationship, and then it's sent to others without your consent. So a good example of this, it's 2 teens under the age of 18 in a private consensual relationship, sharing the intimate image or video within that relationship that is non-exploitative in nature, not illegal. However, if that partner now takes that picture or video and sends it or shows it to anybody outside of that relationship, then that partner, without your consent, then that partner is breaking the law, and they can be actually arrested, charged, and convicted for the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. Those are 4 really good legal scenarios that I provided. And again, there are many more, but those are 4 that we've dealt with on a consistent basis here at the White Hatter. But when it comes to sexual intimacy, I think it's really important to understand that if your partner is not respecting your boundaries and consent, it is so important that you set a verbal and physical boundary with them immediately. It's important to understand that no is a complete sentence. There is no room for negotiation. However, it's also really important for teens to understand that just because, however, the abstinence of no doesn't mean yes, right? Which again is really important for teens and even adults to understand. So this is why setting a clear verbal and physical boundary is important. So if they're not respecting your boundaries and not respecting consent, then immediately saying to them, stop, this is rape, is what we suggest that you say to the partner. And rather than saying this is sexual assault, because by saying stop, this is rape, rape has more of an emotional and psychological effect on the human being, right? So by saying this is rape, it kind of sends a clear message that, hey, what you're doing without my consent. And as a result of that, there could be some significant consequences coming your way legally. So something to think about. Now, when it comes to online consent, especially when it comes to intimate images, It is amazing how often we hear from teens, especially teens who identify as female, how sick and tired they are of other teens, primarily teen boys, sending a message digitally, text messages, send me a nude, send me a nude, send me a nude, right? It is unbelievable. And again, we hear teens, especially those who identify as female, saying they're sick and tired of it. Well, you know what? We have a tool for you that I'm about to share with you. Now, let me be clear on what the law says. If somebody sends you a message, say, hey, send me a nude, that is not illegal under the criminal code. However, if somebody sends you a message saying, hey, send me a nude, and then you send them back a message saying, no, and don't ask me again, if they ask you a second time, then they could potentially be breaking the law. But proving it to the police and to a court of law can be quite difficult. So we've developed a tool to help teens deal with this issue. And here's the tool. It's called the No, It's Rude to Ask for a Nude video. And you can actually download this directly onto your phone. If you have your phone with you and point it at the screen right now to the QR code on the left, you can download it, or you can actually find it on our website, which is www.thewhitehatter.ca. And notice what the picture says. So by downloading this, you can store it in your photo album on your phone. No is a complete sentence. There's no room for negotiation. And then saying it's rude to ask for a nude. Warning, I've screen captured your message as evidence. So if somebody sends you a message saying, hey, send me a nude, I want you to send them this instead. Because clearly it says to them that, no, you don't have my consent. I'm not consenting to this whatsoever. And if you continue to ask me to send you a nude, I've recorded it. And if I bring this to the attention of the police, you could find yourself in difficult situation, because technically, if you're under the age of 18 and somebody's asking for a nude, it could be considered luring under the Criminal Code of Canada. But more importantly, it is definitely what would be classified as harassing communications under the criminal code. So this is a great tool to have in your phone ready to go, that if all of a sudden a teen is being asked to send an unsolicited nude, and is to send this instead. In fact, when we shared this with teens at schools, we get, especially those who identify as female, teen girls standing up going, yeah, thank you, Darren. And a lot of teen boys are going, because again, they didn't understand the law specific to consent on this issue. Now, the other thing that we've heard clearly from teens, especially those who identify as teen girls at school, is how sick and tired they are of teen boys sending them unsolicited sexual images, or what they call dick pics, to them unsolicitedly, right? Like, it is amazing. In fact, we hear teen girls saying, Darren, it's almost as if we have to accept that fact. No, you don't have to accept that fact, because you're not consenting for them to do that, right? So again, we've got a tool to help teens deal with this issue as well. And here's the tool. So warning, stop. Sending an unsolicited dick pic or nude is called indecent communication and is illegal under the Criminal Code of Canada. So again, in this scenario, you can download this by pointing your camera at the QR code at the left, or going to our website to download it. We'll put those in the notes of this YouTube video as well, links to those. But again, if somebody sends you an unsolicited nude, what we want you to do without your consent, we want you to do is we want you to send this instead. Because again, it clearly says, hey, listen, I'm not consenting to you to do this. And if you do, there could be consequences, which includes potentially being arrested, charged, and convicted for indecent communication. Or if the person is sending a dick pic of themselves and they're under the age of 18 and they're sending it to you without consent, that is technically called distribution of child pornography or child sexual abuse material under the Criminal Code of Canada. Great tool that you can use in the online digital world as well, to your advantage. But one of the things I want to share with you is that no matter if this is taking place, either online or offline, it is really important that all of you understand that you are not to blame. Right? Survivors of these types of incidents are not to blame. The person to blame here is the person who has breached your trust, your privacy, and your consent, and is now doing something they shouldn't be doing without your consent. In fact, by them doing that, they are clearly breaking the law, and they can be held accountable to that. So the important message here is that you are not to blame for what has happened. Really important. So there you have it. A quick informational video on consent, teens, and sexual intimacy, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you're interested in any of our other programs that we offer, please do not hesitate to head over to our website, which is www.thewhitehatter.ca, to have a look at all the resources and programs that we have out there for parents, teachers, teens, law enforcement, educators on topics surrounding digital literacy, internet safety, and issues such as what we spoke about in today's video. So on behalf of the entire White Hatter team, team. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you for tuning into our channel. Bye, everybody.